We're just going to start out with the next panel on token stability as a token characteristic. And my name is Kohlhaas. I'm the founder of a company called Linum Labs and a project called Molecule. I was previously with Consensus working on Newport and have been kind of in the token engineering space for the past year, a little bit over a year. And yeah, so on the panel with me, we have some really exciting people to talk about token stability. I think we've all met Michael and Micha just earlier, but maybe just a brief intro to Anish Mohamed. Anish holds a PhD in information security systems. Okay, cool. And he's the CTO and co-founder of a company called Ontici. I've met Anish multiple times on different token engineering events. He's an advisor to many projects in the space and has a lot of deep insight into how we can engineer these systems. Yeah, cool. Just to kick it off, I think stable coins and token stability has kind of become a big topic over the past year. I think currently there's over 50 stable coins that are actually in development. So the design space around stability has exploded. I think stable coins are very different. So if you think about Tether is actually a stable coin, but it's implemented in a very different way than DAI, for example. And as we kind of in token engineering, we're designing highly interactive and also highly volatile systems. So I think stability is one design parameter that we should strive for. And it's even a question if we should strive for that. But maybe just to kick off the conversation with you guys, how do you feel, just from a design perspective, how can we bring in stability into the systems that we're engineering?
Can I be controversial?
Sure, absolutely.
I'm going to be a bit controversial and say the obvious. So in many ways, if there's a very fast-moving ecosystem, one of the things that it should never have is stability. Because as I see it right now, I've been around like in this space for a reasonably long period of time. I still don't think it has reached a stage where there's any sense of normalization. So the previous talk was on identity. We don't have a sense of stability of identity. So what should be allowed is the ability to shift values from one ecosystem to next. So in that sense, maybe thinking about stability and getting stability for everything might be the wrong thing to do. Yes, there is benefit to the ecosystem to do that. But the other thing is there is actually an evolutionary pressure that's being put on top of the dinosaurs of this ecosystem. And maybe mammals are yet to emerge. If that doesn't happen, maybe not. I don't know.
So my feeling is that our definition of stability that we use in the space is actually very limited, because we use it to define this sort of pegging notion, some precise like one-to-one mapping between value. And in fact, like in a more general sense, stability is just a sort of an attractiveness of a particular subset of a state, which sounds really obnoxiously abstract. But what you can realize is you can have stability around equilibrium without being pegged to it. So you can have something that's attractive, and it doesn't even need to be a precise price. It can be any well-defined property. So when I think about stability in terms of value, I think of it in terms of attractiveness of a property, and that attractiveness of a property that we really care about here is more that it's not too noisy. We don't want the thing to be bouncing all over the place, because then it's not very useful. But you can have something that is sort of low-pass filtered, sort of denoised in a sense, without actually requiring that it be pegged to something. So we can move in general, but we also don't have this sort of notion that it's going to bounce all over the place. But to be clear, that's a much fuzzier definition. In order to engineer for that, you kind of need to go into the sort of process that I was describing earlier, because it's actually a much more abstract, formal property, and you can't really get into it unless, if you really want to peg something, what you're really doing is a banknote, and I think there's enough of that going on already.
Yeah, I think pegging something to what we already know at the current state of the cryptocurrency makes a lot of sense, because people don't think in tokens. You cannot put a price in tokens, because people will just not understand it. And so it doesn't need to be pegged in the sense of holding a certain amount of euros in a bank account, but at least it should have the same value, and you should be able to advertise that. I think that from a value stability point of view. And as a consumer, we want price stability. We don't want value stability. There's a lot of talk about money used to be pegged to gold, and that was a good thing. Well, what actually did happen when money was pegged to gold was that price would fluctuate because the value of money could not.
So there was this description of filter, and I just wanted to make sure. Who in this room normally goes to clubs? Pretty much everybody, right? You recognize in front of the person who's a DJ, there's a mixer. You recognize why they have a mixer. Because you don't want to have bland noise. And that actually is a very, well-defined characteristic. Everybody seems to understand that. So there is some benefit in having some sort of stability and some benefit in not having it, and very much contextual. So I really want to bring that in. Like, we as humans have been used to this so-called variations, and we enjoy variations. Sometimes we attenuate it, sometimes we exaggerate it. And effectively what you're doing in a club is essentially attenuating and exaggerating the variation.
So to sort of build on that, when we think about the way that we get value from variation, at least as it pertains to sort of token value, you kind of have a time phase that's sort of associated with our fast changes, which is really kind of hurting us. It makes it hard to be sure about sort of the transactions and whether I'm going to regret that I did something because I could have waited a very short period of time and experienced a very different price because of that volatility. That's sort of the high frequency noise. But what we really want is to retain the slower phase variation, and in fact probably a distribution of variation. It's not we want one mode, but we want a diversity of modes of change that are sort of reasonably reflecting some evolutionary process or whatnot. We're not going to worry about what's causing it, but the idea is to remove the problems that come from high frequency noise and to still not disallow the sort of slower general trends that might be appropriate with the growth of an economy. They're slower phase phenomena that aren't restricted. And when you peg something, when you try to algorithmically force it to a value, you're doing something fundamentally active and forceful that I would argue that isn't even particularly feasible. It's only when you recognize that there's sort of more going on here that you can sort of find the feasible version. And I would say that when we move in this discussion of sort of what I'm going to call sort of second order stability, where we're slowing the rates of change but not stopping change, we're moving into a paradigm that's more feasible than the current sort of what I'll call naive algorithmic stablecoin, which I think has some challenging sort of elements that I'm not sure that we can resolve yet.
No, nothing to add.
No problem. Maybe just bring up one contrarian point again that you raised. So if we look at how systems develop, there's actually a lot of potential in having instability because it allows for arbitrage, for example, between different systems. And so instability in that sense really only allows innovation to happen. So should we over-engineer the systems that we're kind of building towards stability in these early stages, or just kind of also let certain systems run? It's something that I ask myself often with bonding curves.
So I think that kind of ties in. I wouldn't say that the ability to change is instability. That's why we're differentiating between sort of pegging. Not being pegged isn't the same as being unstable. Normally, unstable would apply some sort of runaway process that happens quickly and would likely be destructive in this kind of environment, whereas a sort of slow trend, which we could think of more like evolution, which is driven by something that's, maybe don't think of it as a fast runaway process, but rather sort of some ability to adapt to changing phenomena and thus sort of achieves a desirable property.
I mean, evolution doesn't always give you desirable properties in that sense, sorry. And just to the point of actually having arbitrage could happen in multiple dimensions. In any conditions where there's a local maximum and a global maximum, and somebody has an information advantage, they will and can actually, if they have the resources, do the arbitrage. The question is, can we actually build ecosystems where this arbitrage helps us or doesn't cause large tragedy of commons? That to me would be a very bad situation.
I'd like to add that today we have markets that can be arbitraged, but they're all regulated. So there is a barrier to entry, and there is a barrier to creating these markets and these exchanges. And in the crypto space, there is none. I can set up a crypto exchange, and if I'm successful, then anyone can join and anyone can trade on it. And that it is very difficult in this kind of context to make sure that there is no one that comes along with a large amount of capital and influences the market. And I think in the crypto space, one cause of volatility is because some players benefit from it and they have the capital to make it happen. And there is no laws that, well, allow the police to put them in jail for making that happen, which is the case in the stock exchange.
So that's true, but there's a, what do we call geographical arbitrage, okay? The loss of securities is not a norm across the world. It varies. SEC might go up after people's asses, but that's one way of enforcement. But in reality, if you ask one of the lawyers, is there any lawyers in this audience? Could you please put your hand up? Okay. No, normally there are, so I generally make sure that, you know, I confer with them because I'm pretty sure that's the case, that there's a geographical arbitrage. This is what I was saying. It's like, one of the biggest problems we are having is we will always have these arbitrages and these local maximas. And whenever somebody figures out, this is what the whole problem is, you know, do we have a clear idea of the bounds, okay? And is there any possibility that a particular game, if played, that will be at the cost of everybody in this ecosystem? Well, it's like the classic one I described is the 2008 meltdown, right? That was a game being played against the system because there's a concept of the tragedy of commons and the risk being underwritten by everybody else. For me, if I do token engineering, and to me, a success of an ecosystem is that if such a game is played, you know, it's expensive, B, it's bounded, and C, if possible, we can actually take some remediation measures, either inbound, or as in bounded within the boundaries of the ecosystem, or other mechanisms outside. So you could have an oracle of some kind that communicates to the outside world. When I say an oracle, what that means is like somebody calling up SEC in that sense, loose sense of speaking, right? So that's something we have to think about. That's the way, because like the crypto system right now has no ability to enforce in that sense the way we would actually have in a centralized world. It's still a lacking tooth. I mean, that's my view. I could be wrong.
So when we're sort of discussing the conditions under which a system might have sort of these properties, so you're describing the sort of failure modes of a system. And so, you know, with the methods that I've been working on, you know, one of the main goals is to specify those most important criteria and actually, whenever possible, ensure them analytically. And in the case of sort of these stability concepts where we have well-defined equilibrium, again, this sort of work up front to have the notion of a well-defined equilibrium. When you are able to do that, though, you would generally approach it with these things that work like, they came up in the questions after my talk, these Lyapunov functions that are sort of generalized energy functions, and the way that you use them, like in these situations, is to say that my analytical properties of the system imposed by my token design has this energy function that is dissipative, meaning that whenever I take an action in the legal set of actions, so now we're not worrying so much about the specific instance of the behavior, but all of the behavior that's allowed under the sort of token mechanisms, that anything that I could do at best dissipates it. It basically is equal in energy or dissipates it, and what that does is it ensures that you're, as an agent trying to strategize and sort of cheat the game, so to speak, benefit unfairly, you're sort of bounded by the case where the value is conserved rather than sort of somehow finding somewhere this hidden, you know, direction in which I could benefit at someone else's expense, precisely because the system is sort of analytically bounded by some abstracted energy function. And I know that's sort of tough from a, you know, how do I execute on that perspective? But
it's pretty hard to actually bound it. You're talking about an adversarial model and effectively saying, you know, this is the bound for anything. So there are a bunch of notions. I mean, I'm supposed to give a talk, and I'm going to try give some notions of what an adversarial function is. To me, it's an adversarial function. We are trying to define things and describe things in a manner that we can say, okay, this behavior is bounded by this and this. And to me, all the things that existed previously, the arbitrage happens when somebody figures out there's a delta that exists, which is still, let's think about the ICOs, right? Literally, that was an arbitrage that happened when somebody figured out there's this tiny gray area in the legality framework where something could actually pass through. This information could be sent through and you can actually do some action. And so the same happens. It's like, to me, the thing is like understanding the bounds and actually having extra mechanisms if something fails. Do we have the ability to invoke them? I don't know, something like that.
Interesting.
I think you bring up an interesting point. So previously we've had a lot of stability that has been like government enforced, and you just talked about the legalities and legal gray holes. So I think one aspect I think that like stablecoins specifically should thrive for or strive for is obviously censorship resistance. But I think this entire conversation opens up a lot of just questions around, in general, where are the future of governments in systems like this and in providing stability to a system like this? Michael, do you want to?
So when we consider, we've been talking about algorithmic stablecoins, and I think when you get into the question of governments, it's probably more appropriate to talk about what I would call sort of like I call them banknotes. They're effectively an issuer says, here, this thing's worth this much because I say so. And in a sense, that issuing entity is the sort of source of trust in that scenario. And it's worth the face value insofar as you trust that party to like guarantee that it will continue to be worth that. And whether or not the governments take the role of issuers or other parties take the role of issuers, if like bank type entities take those roles, one of the interesting things about the space is that we've kind of opened an environment where sort of anyone can raise their hand and say, I am going to be an issuer. So we've essentially decentralized the ability to take that role, but the role itself is sort of centralized in the sense that, well, once I'm an issuer of something and I've claimed a denominated face value, some degree that thing is centralized to me. So there's a nice sort of opening of that space, and I think it causes us to examine even our definition of decentralized. Like, are stable coins of the banknote type decentralized if you can say, well, anyone who wants to can go make a token, declare it to be worth a certain value, and then from the perspective of the rest of the network, it's like metadata is that it's claimed to be pegged in a sense to this value, and some issuer is the sort of party saying so.
Oh, sorry.
Well, we can see that works actually because of Tether. Tether has in their terms and conditions, it says very explicitly that they have no obligation of buying back their token. So whoever buys their token, even though they hold 100% of reserves, and maybe they do, it doesn't really matter because they did not promise to buy any tokens back. The fact is that they do act in the exchanges to keep the value as close as possible to the dollar, and this has worked so far. But it is basically a belief that it will work, and if someday the founders of Tether decide that they don't want to play the game anymore and take a vacation in the Bahamas, well, it will crash.
So to me, I would prefer a day where we could have more rigorous proofs of all these claims to be made. So there was a variation, if I'm not mistaken, from 1 to 0.9 for one of the stability coins recently. And there have been other mechanisms by which you could actually leverage this existence of stable coins. So effectively, you can use that as a connection between two different games being played in two ecosystems. So, the thing to me is like, A, being able to provide issuances of proof, which could be clearly validated, okay? Not like arbitrary statements of proof of, the reason I was talking about attestation is there should be things that you could validate. You don't need to have that extra information, but just knowledge of, rules of the game should be able to validate what it is. So that has to happen, and that should be publicized and standardized so everybody could actually have a fair game. Right now, if it's an unfair game, I can put my hand up and make a claim, I'm going to issue $1 billion. And ICOs were essentially that. You printed money, and then whatever happened had happened.
I've heard there's a great public database that you can put such auditable information on.
It sounds a little bit to me like you're proposing a stablecoin standard, like literally a standard.
It doesn't have to be a standard. When you say it's a standard, it's like, okay, this is what it is. I'm saying if you have a mechanism, it should be clearly defined, okay? Right? So it's like you don't need to have extra information and extra assets to be able to verify a claim being made. Whether it's a stable coin or whatever coin, stable is a characteristic that you make a claim on, right? I'm saying if you make a claim, provide proof.
Sure. So what I was actually saying was sort of then slightly orthogonal but related, which was that you could, in fact, if you want to decentralize the notion that we were discussing earlier, the banknote model, is that you could literally write a standard for a token which was effectively, just an ERC20 type or 777 whatnot, that essentially was sort of added a little bit of specification to the extent that we were just saying, well, I'm issuing my banknote, and then you could have an entire market that was really about their trust in the belief that you claimed of the price, which is a little silly. It's sort of, but at the same time, it exposes what it means to say that anyone can be the bank in that setting.
I just want to add to this, linking myself into this discussion, that exactly 735, the idea of why making it a separate standard is that you could actually attach such a claim system to a stablecoin token contract. Yeah. And then anybody can issue claims, Exactly. So basically anybody can issue claims, is this trustable or not, and you can see it right on
you
the
don't
coins.
Need extra information to prove it. That's exactly what I'm kind of saying. It's like, there should be, this is information asymmetry that exists. People shouldn't have to be held hostage for information asymmetry. Blockchain as a mechanism is supposed to let us loose from this information asymmetries. That is actually a hierarchy of power and hierarchy of wealth. So if we have a mechanism, why don't we use it?
But you just need standards in order that you are able to read that and display it in different interfaces properly.
But there still needs to be trust in your token for its value to be stable. So it's either trust that you actually hold a value or that someone holds a value. You can prove that because it's in a smart contract of some sort. Or the volume of your coin is so big and it is so widespread that it has value in itself because it's a mean of exchange, and that's the value of the dollar, for example.
So what I find really interesting here is this equivalence class that we just constructed, because suppose I take my ERC20 type of token and then I'm going to make it a claim that it's stable and attach it to my identity. So now this token is essentially defined by only two things: my identity according to an identity specification, and the other piece of data that says sort of this assertion about it being, I'm at least proposing that it's worth, say, $1 or €1, that which thing it's worth. And then after that, it's not likely to be stable. It's actually likely to revert to a reputation mechanism over you, which is literally going to fluctuate against the thing that you claimed it's against. But that fluctuation will actually become a measure of your reputation as opposed to a measure of any other form of value.
Can I say one small thing and I'll give it to you? Actually, this exists today. Why do you have Moody's and other things? Moody's and all the other crap that you have, and they are the reasons of 2008 meltdown, right? So they actually had a reputation system. So it exists already. The whole global ecosystem is based on a reputation system.
Very shortly, you don't pay your groceries with shares. So Moody's and the like are, they give you trust in some company, or also in governments. But anyway, you don't pay your groceries in shares.
Okay, so
I just would like to add to the claims, right? It's not, the interesting thing is that the token itself is also an identity, right? It's a thing in itself, can receive claims, but these claims can, for example, be even a formal verification proof that the mathematics behind this balanced system is working correctly. So this way you see, there's a token, there's a formal verification proof, I can run that, check that against a certain specification, which is then verified by experts, which is a reputation system, and it's glued right to the token itself, and I can basically auto run that, see, yes, that thing says it's stable based on... these things which actually can execute in my browser even in the moment when I check it, and that's interesting. And
So if
respond to what he said, I didn't get a chance to respond to what you said. Yeah. So what I was about to say to your thing was, like, you were saying Moody's doesn't, the reputation of Moody's doesn't care. I mean, doesn't have a direct impact on the market. The market is not that market. Market is for your share. If you have your bond and your bond or a share that's like with triple C or whatever the crap is, like a junk bond equivalent, you're done. Your market value is 0 or negative, right? Whereas if it's a triple A, even though they have never ever recalculated like what he was describing, right? CDOs were created like 15 years ago. You bundle the shit together and you call it gold. And it was called gold again, right? There is no verification of proof at the instant that you're going to buy it.
Well, it was a claim of a trusted party. That's exactly the same thing. It's a claim of someone you trust. So
or math, right?
But still, the vast majority of people don't understand the math, so they need to trust the claim of someone who does.
So what I really like about the fact that we got into attestations of facts is that one of the most important decentralized properties in my mind is the fact that we don't have to have them all be consistent, so that they're subjective. For starters, math even itself, as much as I love it, like, you make some assumptions and there's some level of it's true given a certain given that. In this case, you might have an array of attestations that aren't even necessarily consistent, and in fact, that's like, we can accept that that's okay and even make our own decisions about which set of the attestations we want to trust, back to being based on the identities. Furthermore, there can be multiple types of attestations. Stability in general is there's two kinds of validation. Actually, it's validation and verification. So verification is about asserting that the sort of code exactly represents the thing that you intended it to, right? Whereas sort of validation is actually whether, when we're talking about math, does the math that you have sort of produce a stable system in the sense that it has the intended equilibrium? That's sort of a validation proof. Versus sort of a verification proof, which is generally that the sort of smart contract that you actually coded actually truly implements the mathematics that you sort of intended, right? There's this characterization between the two. It's a little bit nuanced, but actually important enough that I might actually want attestations of both types, and I might actually care about who they came from, and I might care about how many are favorable and maybe some small number are unfavorable. But if there's a small number of unfavorable ones from renowned experts, then maybe I choose not to trust it anyway. So I think there's a lot of packaging of trust and identity into the notions that we're opening around stability.
Thanks, Mike. I want to bring the topic back a little bit, but I love how we're meshing the previous talk with this and exploring, the intersection between identity and stablecoins and stability. It's fascinating. So a lot of applications, I think, that we're all building in this ecosystem will eventually need to rely on stable forms of value in some form or another. And I think a lot of adoption in the space has also been hindered by constant volatility, which is often what, if you speak to someone who's not from the space, they'll often lament the fact, how much Bitcoin is going up and down. Or so perceived volatility from the outside for us as an industry as a whole has been has had negative connotations for many use cases. From your perspective, what needs to happen from an adoption perspective, or what are the obstacles that we need to overcome to really plug stability into some of these use cases?
Honestly, actually, I think the first obstacle is kind of our own interjection of tokens, because the simplest way to clean up the use case is to just not try to impose your own form of value and use what is essentially an sub-accounting invoice type of model, where you just say that the token represents a future commitment to pay, and that you say but it's actually I'm basically saying I've made a commitment to pay so many dollars. That commitment flows to wherever it flows, and someone redeems it not from some bank somewhere, but literally in form of payment from the party who made the commitment. So the only thing that's actually flowing is sub-accounting. And to be fair, that's not that exciting from a token engineering perspective, because it's literally just accounting. But if you wanted to build your app that way, you would literally just be charging someone. Maybe they'd go to your website and pay some money, and then when they accumulate debts in the sub-accounting, they're banked. They're not even banked. It's just measuring what you owe, and then you pay it in some interval. It's just accounting. But we put ourselves into them when we put our tokens in there and say, my so-and-so token with my app or with my protocol.
But
so I'm again going to be looking at it in a slightly more abstract sense. So I think if you think of most ecosystems as they evolve, initially there will be massive variations. And the thing that happens is friction essentially sets in. And when friction sets in, until it reaches a critical mass, the variation will be so massive. If you were looking at data, so that's one of the idiotic things I've been doing. So if you have been looking at data, and I did this pretty long, like 6+ years. So if you've been looking at the volatility and the volume, and you look at it, you can see that as the volume becomes bigger and bigger, because it's like have two systems being connected to a pipeline, right? The volume of the pipe is kind of bounded. Otherwise, you need to have some other mechanism to transfer this volume between the two. So it's like, unless it gets to a stage where it's large enough, the volatility will happen, because there are people who would gain from this, and because the ability of people to actually nudge systems right now is so high. I am not being controversial when I say there are a lot of people who nudge the value of various tokens, stroke currencies, and some of them have been caught out in public. So, there is a large amount of game making that's happening. And even though we say we design tokens as nicely as we could, we have no mechanism to prevent those things from happening, other than I don't know what.
Yeah, there could be a stablecoin based on mutual credit, which is what you suggested, and barter. So if I know that one sheep is worth 1,000 eggs, and etc., and I can just compute that because it's available publicly, then I have kind of a stable coin because I know how many people have pledged to pay how much of products. But in the short term, to get adoption, I think we need to tokenize euros and dollars and Swiss francs and stuff, because most people out there, they don't think in tokens, they think in euros and dollars. And if we want people to adopt our dApps, we need to be able to tokenize these euros and dollars.
Cool. I want to open it up to questions from the audience here. Anyone wants to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts about some stable coins that are decentralized, that they have algorithms inside, that they have collateral inside, such as MakerDAO single collateral DAI and multi-collateral DAI that I think that is coming?
So I am a fan of MakerDAO, actually. I do have some feeling that it's currently sort of, we believe that it's stable, and that belief in its stability is the main reinforcing loop. I would say from a mathematical perspective, we would have to sort of break down the design and try to write out the differential equations and see if we could construct one of these Lyapunov functions. And in fact, I'm considering if I can ever make the time, I'd actually very much like to do that, because as a fan, I would like to know that, and I think it would very much influence at least any decisions that I might make about what to do with that ecosystem. But I also think that that comes into play for governance as well, because if we actually better understand not just the observational past of stability, which really only tells us whether the conditions for instability have been met, right? You see, like, the flash crash occurred when a CDP got liquidated sort of unexpectedly, and it recovered quickly, which tells you that the complete system, the feedback loop that includes the human response, was sufficient to recover it, which is a very good sign. The question is, though, is that driven solely by the human behavior, or is it also, in a sense, more strongly guaranteed by their algorithms irrespective of the human behavior, right? Is the human behavior pattern a required element?
Thank you so much, Michael. I want to give time for just another question. Yeah, Sean.
So tokens are information units, and mostly what we spoke about here are sort of extrinsic measures of information, and whether that's reputation or a supply number or whatever is created, rather than intrinsic measures. So with tokenization, we can embed a lot more data, and we can also use third-party Oracle data sources to continue to verify the data that is claimed within a token. So we haven't spoken at all today about the role of Oracle, but I think that might take some information.
Was that more of a statement than a question? Is that the right direction?
So it goes back to the claim question, right? So effectively, if I were to take his talk and decompose it as an oracle, so if I have a passport, the oracle is essentially the one that validates my crap and gives me a passport, right? So you could somehow attach a weighted knapsack to the set of all claims, and you can have a function that, an integral function that sums across all those claims and gives you value of the data. That's a different question. That essentially implies there is a market value for the so-called attestation by that particular oracle. So I don't know if that's a reality, and maybe tomorrow or day after, what might happen.
I would say that in the case of sort of this other information, the first question we have to ask is, what is the property that we're saying is stable? So if we're talking about sort of more complex information, we're not just talking about financial sort of commodity valued things, then I would say stability would be well defined over any property that you can make well defined, but then you would have to engineer it to do so. So in the case of there's lots of data involved in the assets, then we could define much more sophisticated properties, and then we could define stability around those properties. But that's an exercise that has to do with the data that's actually in those tokens.
All right. Hi, guys. So it seems that a lot of the sort of argument for having stablecoins is because we want to make it easy for these last mile users to use our tokenized ecosystems because they understand US dollars and so on. And I'm wondering, are we making a mountain of a molehill? I mean, why not just let them use US dollars and do a just-in-time conversion, right? I know time after time after time, people ask us, well, does Ocean have a stablecoin and all this? Or why don't you have a two-token system? And we're like, well, people can use a data exchange where they buy with US dollars, they buy data, et cetera, and that's it. So there's no need for all this extra fancy complexity. And as time goes on, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when Bitcoin, et cetera, when Bitcoin becomes the world reserve currency, then it will start to slow down and probably won't lose 95% of its value the way that the US dollar did in the last 100 years. So I don't know. I question why we have any stablecoins at all for most use cases. Yes, there are some niche ones, but yeah. Tell me, I mean, are we making a mountain out of a molehill?
Well, there are a lot of use cases where you need to hold value for a longer period of time than just commercial exchange. And for all these use cases, you need a stable coin. You wouldn't want to have your mortgage in Bitcoin. And I mean, you want to hold your reserve and you want to hold stuff in the blockchain that keeps its value. If you make a contribution to a charitable organization and you want to follow the chain of payment, you want this chain of payment to not lose 50% of its value from the moment when you made the donation to the moment that it's spent. So there are use cases where stable coins make a lot of sense in blockchain.
So I'm going to go, actually, I very much agree with you, Trent, and in fact, it's one of the things that we've worked on mathematically is the equipment necessary to do that kind of just-in-time conversion against a sort of an internal valuation that's derived basically from more math stuff, but is not actually dependent on an oracle, but rather dependent on sort of the sort of behavior of people and a sort of crowd-fused behavior to estimate the relative price of assets so that you can accomplish just-in-time conversions without relying on an external source of the price, and with strong belief that this is highly attracted to the property that the price I have is actually quite good, and good enough in expectation that I can prefer the on-chain oracle, so to speak, over the risks associated with the off-chain oracle.
So my thought would be like, this is not a new problem. Absolutely not a problem. It's like if you've ever worked in the finance space, you can see this problem has been around. There have been lots of solutions that exist. We could easily borrow one of the solutions from them and then see what happens.
Yeah, I think we
need to
wrap it up. But that was a highly fascinating panel, guys. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
Um,
So,